Good morning. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off. I do want to back up just a hair from where we left off last week. I know it's hard for anybody to be able to say they've not paid attention and noticed what's going on in the news this past week between our different branches of government. And I'm hoping some of the history that we've gone through, that when you see some of this stuff going on, that a bell goes off in your head and says, that sounds like the same mistake in history that I heard about before that we are repeating because people don't know about the mistakes made in history. One of the last things that I had talked about was, if I get the right sheet. Before we talked about King George, we talked about another king, King James. And do you remember what the most important thing that I discussed that he did, that the people had to rise up and claim the power back away from him, had to do with separation of powers between the different branches of government? Well, we witnessed this past week, if you watched any of the news, the exact same battle going on. One branch of government taking and stealing power from another branch of government, while the other branch of government doesn't even really complain much, depending on which party's in power. But when it is a particular party in power, then they complain a lot, unless it's them doing it. So when I'm through with this history, we'll go over some of what has gone on this past week, hopefully. But I hope that some more of you are becoming more aware of what type of things are going on here in our own government, and realize, just like Patrick's lesson this morning, it's not us and it's not those individuals that we see abusing their powers that's in control. It is God. And as Christians, us seeing what's going on around us in this country, knowing the gift that we've been given of the form of government that we have, we should always be questioning in our minds, well, why is this type of stuff happening if God's in control? Well, maybe that's, if we look at history, not only at its mistakes, but at how God corrected a lot of those mistakes. God gave warning, and there were certain people that would stand up and take heed of that warning to help lead people back to the right path. Well, there's no difference than what's going on right now. It's just that it's not history for us. It's what's going on right now. God knocking at the door saying, you need to pay attention and get right. You're straying. So we're going to pick up again with King George III. He was the king in power when we fought for our independence in this country. Like I mentioned last week, a lot of people think that we fought for independence because we got tired of paying the taxes that we were paying. But the taxes was way down the list on the grievances that the people had against the king. So our war for independence was not about tea or the taxes on tea. But Great Britain was passing laws in Parliament that affected the colonists over here, enforced on them. But the colonists here had no representation in Parliament over there. That right was guaranteed to them since the year 1215, that they would have representation. But Parliament said, oh yeah, we've got representation for you over here. Because you're way over there, and it's too much trouble, to just hop on an airplane and fly over here and make your grievances known to us, we've found some volunteers that will represent you in Parliament. Well, the colonists said that if you're making laws over there that have to do with us, and that you never have to live under those laws, then you do not represent us. So representatives writing laws that affect us while exempting themselves from those laws is in fact legislation without representation. That was one of the primary reasons that the British citizens took up arms against their country and fought for independence from that king. Our founders knew that that was oppressive and it was tyranny, and they fought to end that. A lot of what they stood up, that they said enough is enough, we today sit back and just say, well, that's just how government operates. Or we accept it. Well, that's the lesser of two evils. Our party is at least in power. It's better than the other party in power. And it doesn't matter which one you're talking about. They're not happy with what's going on, no matter which party is in power. But it's got to be better than if the other guy was in power. So, they passed a series of taxes to collect money for the debt that was accrued during the French and Indian War. Because, King James, he had battles, he had a large empire to retain power on. He had battles all over the world. But the one over here was particularly expensive, the French and Indian War, where many of our forefathers that fought for our independence fought as British subjects, which they were, against the French and the Indians. Because the French, of course, and Spain as well, to the south, were all fighting for this territory. Well, that accrued a very large debt to the kingdom. So in a way to try and recoup that, they, just like today, well, we need money, we'll just pass taxes. So they put a tax on linen, on lumber, and these taxes are above and beyond and only applied to the colonists over here. But they tax linen, lumber, paper, tea, sugar, and ink. All items necessary for survival for the colonists. Then they get an idea to maximize the revenue by mandating that the colonists actually have to purchase those items. No choice. So they make it against the law for them to buy anything that the British government does not approve. And I'm glad that we don't have any kind of taxes like that today. At least we're not living in New York where you're taxed for a supersized Coke or too much sugar or not having a health care plan. So to ensure that they're buying the right stuff and not boycotting, because back then, we take for granted we've been programmed. Our income taxes are automatically taken out of our paychecks. We never see them. Well, it hasn't always been that way. All up until that time, till our New Deal in this country changed the way our taxes are taken, every person had to actually pay taxes to the government directly out of their pocket. Well, our founders believed that our First Amendment right that they eventually included in our Bill of Rights protected free speech. Well, they actually considered refusing to pay your taxes as a form of free speech. Even then. Well, so they're exercising their free speech during this time when their government that did not represent them charged them a tax. They said, we're not paying that. So all of this stuff could also be manufactured in the United States, but in this country, in the colonies then. So they said, you don't represent us. This is oppressive taxation. We're not going to do it. So they do it on their own. Well, the government realizes that. And so they passed a law. They passed a law called Writs of Assistance. It gave the custom agents and tax collectors the power to search and seize property without proper warrants. Because, we had the right to be protected in our persons and possessions and things long before our Bill of Rights, before the Fourth Amendment. That came earlier in history. We even covered that from one of the 5 documents that we've learned about. One of the items that came from that was that you could not take or search or seize anybody's personal property without proper warrants. But this writs of assistance from the king bypassed all of that and said, we don't care about that. So we didn't invent the right of the people to be secure in their persons, places, and papers and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures, also known as the Fourth Amendment. But we inherited it from the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was written way back in 1215. So since 1215, the people knew they had a right not to have to suffer that. But having a right in something written on paper is one thing, but having to defend that right against tyranny is another. So, if an agent raids your house and finds something that he does not think you should have because of the Stamp Act, or maybe it's just a particular firearm or accessory or herbal remedy even, or maybe he just does not like you to have it, well, then you're arrested, thrown in prison, and transported to Quebec for trial. Quebec was a British colony also at the time, but they had petitioned the British Parliament to retain their French law. So French law does not give you the right to a trial by your peers, which was something unique to British law. So the government then would transport them there so they could circumvent a trial by jury of their own citizens. Kind of sounds like a FISA court. So our independence movement was not over taxes. It was over a list of things. It was over representation, legislation without representation. It was over mandated purchases. It was over warrantless searches and seizures, denial of due process, and also having foreign courts and foreign law dictate what happened to us as citizens. This is how we got our Declaration of Independence. It was not over tea or taxes on tea. It was this type of tyranny. So what kind of government were we prior to our independence? We were a kingdom. So in a kingdom, the king holds all the rights and power. And the king hands out those rights and powers as he sees fit, arbitrarily. If he decides that he wants to take them back, what can the king do? He can take them back without any recourse of the citizenry or subjects. Our framers said this kingdom thing isn't working out very well for us at all. So, because kings only keep their promises when a sword is held to their throats by the people. So the instant the sword comes down, the king goes back to being a king, and the people go back to being subjects. So they decided, we're not going to do the kingdom thing anymore. We're going to be free men in a republic, specifically a constitutional republic. In a constitutional republic, the people hold all the rights and all the powers. Of course, you haven't heard this said in quite a while. The people delegate powers to the governments as they see fit, And that's not just the federal government. As we'll see when we even go over what's written in our Declaration of Independence. They didn't feel that way just about the king or a central form of government. They felt this way about every level of government because we as citizens, made in the image of God, are sovereign beings. And as sovereign beings, then we have the control of what affects us. And governments were not instituted to take care of us, except in certain specific ways, which we'll see when we look at the Declaration of Independence, what specific purpose those governments are to have. But if we can delegate the powers to the government as we see fit, what else can we do? Too far. Back one more. I didn't put it on there. Well, if we have all the powers and we're delegating them, what can we do with those powers that we've delegated? We can take them back. That's exactly what they did in 1776. So shortly after our war for independence, people started begging George Washington to be king. We should be thankful that some of our framers realized that the king thing was not working, including George Washington. Is there anybody here that didn't know that after we won our independence, that there was a big movement to ask George Washington to be our king? They even made a huge monument for him. But he, being a godly man, understanding why we fought for what we fought, and was also a very humble man. He didn't want that power. How many people do you think, or that you could think of, could be offered power like that and say, I don't want it, that's not right? Do any of our representatives behave that way? All right. Chief Justice Earl Warren said, what we have now is a republic, if you can keep it. Just look at what's going on today. You see how easy it is to either allow it to be taken or to even just give it away. So we all know people, family and friends, and politicians that believe that we're a democracy. You even hear politicians say it, news people say it. But a democracy is nothing more than two wolves and one sheep deciding what's for dinner. And we have to stop just rolling our eyes and shaking our heads when we hear people say it. A democracy is no different than a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many tyrants tell you what you're going to do. A kingdom or monarchy has only one ruler. But in a democracy, the majority of the people in the group are the masters. They realized in the Declaration of Independence that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So our Declaration tells us, we're not here to listen to what the government tells us we should do and what we can and can't do, because we've given certain powers to the government, and that's their sole purpose. In a constitutional republic, since we delegated the powers, what can we do? We can take them back. So, also in the Declaration of Independence, that when any form of government operates contrary to those principles, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, establishing new governments that will abide by those principles. Our founders knew that even though they had studied history, a lot of it, and recognized what evil and oppressive kings or governments do, and they were struggling to form a form of government that would allow us to not have to suffer under that tyranny. Because up until then, the only way to change a government, if you were in a kingdom, was to do what? Openly rebel and chop off their head and get a new king. We don't operate that way here yet, thank goodness. They tried to create a form of government where we could change the government when we see fit that it's not operating as it's supposed to. But in a democracy, the majority holds all the rights and the powers. So what else happens in a democracy in that case? The majority hands out the rights as they see fit. So whether it's a monarchy or a group of people, which is fine if you're in the majority, because then you get to decide what you hand out and don't. But if the majority hands out the rights and you're not in the majority, what can they do? They can take them back. So what they tell you you can do today, and you say something that they don't like, and you offend them, tomorrow, guess what they're going to do? They're going to take it back. So the Declaration tells us that to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's the purpose of government. Not to give us everything we need from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. God does that. Heard an excellent lesson on it this morning. That's the only purpose of government, to ensure our liberties are protected from somebody else. And not just for us, the people that fought for independence. They weren't fighting for their independence. They were fighting for ours. Because they knew most of them wouldn't even live through the fight. They were doing it for their children and for their grandchildren and millions of people they didn't even know. So the minority has nothing unless the majority says so. You only have what you have as long as they say so. And there has never been an instance where the minority has ever affected change in a democratic society. Ever. And there's a lot of current examples you can look at too. Anybody noticed what's been going on in Venezuela the last few weeks or months? That's the type of government that many in our elected officials are calling for us to change to. It's not working out so well. It never has. The civil rights movement could have never happened in a democratic society. Rosa Parks proved that we are not a democracy, because if we were, she would still be sitting in the back of the bus. In a democracy, minorities never have a society-changing voice. That has only happened in a constitutional republic where laws are made for equal representation. Do you want to live in a democracy? Then to continue to let our neighbors, friends, teachers, and politicians continue to call us a democracy. They know that if you repeat a lie long enough, it will become the truth. Now, you might not mind living in a democracy as long as you are in the majority or the mob. However, the minute you're in the minority, you have nothing. Because our framers knew that democracies don't preserve liberty, they only guarantee that there will always be masters and slaves. So they gave us a constitutional republic. And as we read a minute ago, the Constitution tells us why. The main focus of our founders was our liberty. Many of them read the writings of John Locke and his recognition of natural law. They all understood that we were created in the image of God, Genesis 1:23. So who are we? How did we go from 13 British colonies to 13 sovereign and independent states in 1776? We didn't just wake up one morning and it happened. What events caused it? What people helped lead us to do that? What was the general attitude of our representatives back then? In the address to the General Assembly to the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia on January 23rd, 1799, this is what the representatives stated they felt it was their duty as a representative. It said, unwilling to shrink from our representative responsibilities, it would be deceitful in those entrusted with the guardianship of the state sovereignty and acting under the solemn obligation of the following oath. I do swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States, not to warn you of encroachments which, though with a pretext of necessity or disguised by arguments of expediency, may yet establish precedents which may ultimately devote a generous and unsuspicious people to all the consequences of usurped power. Go back to that a minute. In 1799, they called it deceitful if they did not do one thing as a representative. As a representative, they did not warn us of encroachments. An encroachment is when a government or king exercises a power that they do not have on us. That is an encroachment. Or another type of encroachment is if one branch of government exercises a power that it does not have because that power belongs to another branch of government. Those are two different forms of encroachment. And back then, the representatives stated it's their duty to warn us when that happens. Not cause it to happen or look the other way when it happens. Because they called it deceitfulness. And why? It doesn't even matter what argument that you make. They're saying even if it is under the pretext of necessity or disguised by arguments of expediency, we've got to pass a bill before you can read it. Or your First Amendment right to free speech or freedom of religion. You know, we really need to suppress it just a little bit for your safety because this other group of people who exercise their religion want to kill you. So if you'll just allow us to take some of your liberty, we will promise you security. They've been doing this a long time, 150 years. We haven't had a constitutional government in 150 years, at least. So which came first? The states or the federal government? Because we had 13 colonies. But how did we get to the states and to the United States? It wasn't like that. So how did we change from being British subjects and colonists living in 13 colonies to freemen, sovereign citizens living in 13 independent states? Was it just open rebellion? Or was it actually a legal process under British law that they followed. What day did we become free from Great Britain? Anybody got an idea what date in history? You know, we celebrate our independence on what day? July the 4th. But that's not the day that we became free men. The Lee Resolution was first proposed by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia on June 7th, 1776. It was an act of the Second Continental Congress declaring that the 13 colonies to be independent of the British Empire. It is also the earliest form and draft of the Declaration of Independence. So the Lee Resolution states, resolved that these united colonies are and of right to be free and independent states. And I also want you to notice, I was very meticulous in copying the text because both the words, the punctuation, the spelling, everything is important. They pay more attention to their grammar than we do today. But that they of a right to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and to the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. We don't talk that way anymore either. But there are several things that we need to look at. Not yet. We're still looking. Notice at the very first, it does not say that these United States are and of right to be free. We were not the United States yet. We were still colonists when this was drafted. But they were united as 13 colonies to stand against the Empire of Great Britain. And down in the middle, it said that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain, and that state has a capital S in it. Because Great Britain is a country, right? Just like France, Spain, Germany. They're countries, yes, but they're states. Back then, state meant country. That's why it's a capital S and not a lowercase s. So, because that's going to be important when we get to our Declaration of Independence. And you hear what they're talking about. We've got to come up with a plan to have a way of forming alliances, and also to create a confederation between the colonies. What's it sound like they got in mind? A central government. But it's not in existence yet. But they know that there will be a need for central government because they learned way back before 1100 that there was one purpose for a central government, was there not? To do four things: to carry out peace, war, negotiations for treaties, and to provide for common defense. They asked one man in history back in, 1014? A man named Ethelred. We want you to be our king, but we don't want you to control us. We just need you to do those four things and then leave us alone. The same agreement that was made back then for that king, or you could view it as a central government if you want. Because they were asking that king to do one thing, and that was to help protect their liberties from outside forces, outside the country. Well, that's the same thing that our founders are going to say, well, we need a central government to do the same thing. So the Lee Resolution was a three-step process to become independent from Great Britain. And it was brought before the Continental Congress on July 2nd, 1776. It was debated, voted on, and ratified into law in one day. So on that day, the states became free and independent, not out of open rebellion, but out of an act of Congress, and was done in a manner just as legally binding as any law passed today that is constitutional. Not any law, as long as it's constitutional. So the states existed prior to the Declaration of Independence. We did not become states on July 4th, 1776, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We became states on July 2nd, 1776, with the Lee Resolution. The U.S. Constitution still does not exist yet, and will not for over a decade. They adopted the Articles of Confederation on March 1st, 1781, after being ratified. It was the first attempt at a union of the states, but it had many problems with it. The Articles of Confederation were later dissolved in 1789. The U.S. Constitution still does not exist, but the states as independent sovereign states or countries does. There's no three branches of central government. Only the state governments existed during this period. Yet they kept working on creating the Constitution because they wanted a more perfect union. If we truly understood, we would operate differently in our daily lives today. So the states are the creators of the U.S. Constitution. The states are the creators of the federal government, just like it's actually a binding contract, a specific type of contract. It's known as a compact, which is what's made between governments. So it's legal and binding under contract law. So the Declaration of Independence said, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." Sound familiar? It was in the Lee Resolution. So what are states? We look to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. This is nearly verbatim the first clause of the Lee Resolution. So that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have. So now we've gone from 13 colonies. Back up a second. To free and independent states with a capital S. Independent governments, countries. And as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Notice that it reads states, not the United States of America yet. But this spits in the eye of King George. Subjects do not have the authority to declare themselves free no more than slaves do. They did so because we are made in the image of God. God gives us our liberty, our freedom, and we don't need your permission for it anymore, is what they were stating. So they were colonies, now they're states. What's the difference, you might ask? Well, colonies are not free and independent at all. Colonies need the permission of the king to do anything. That's why it took so long. They had to petition the king. It had to go travel by ship overseas. Then the king had to decide what he wanted to do, or Parliament. And then the response had to come back. And they were very patient. They had tried to petition the king for redress of their grievances for over a decade before this happened, with no favorable response. The only response they got was higher taxation to try and control their lives. Yet states are free and independent. States do not need the permission of the king or of the federal government for that matter, which we'll get to later. But remember, we're talking about the time period after the Lee Resolution and the Declaration of Independence, but before the ratification of the Constitution. So what are free and independent states? Again, we look to the words of the founders in the Declaration of Independence. And that's what we've just done. Like Great Britain, Spain, and France, the people of each state need to realize that they are free and independent countries, and that has not changed even after the ratification of the Constitution. Each state in our union is the same as an independent country, just like Great Britain, Germany, and France. So some people may say, yeah, but you surrendered that power when you joined the union. But that is a legal impossibility. Have you ever heard of a sovereign nation called Germany? You ever heard of the European Union? Did that mean that Germany surrendered its sovereignty to join the European Union? What would they say if you flew over there and told them that they are no longer a sovereign country since they joined the European Union? They would laugh in your face. So, to Americans that live in Texas, Georgia, and Ohio, why do we accept that notion?
We fought a war, and we lost. And eventually they'll fight a war in Europe, and they'll probably lose that too. And it will be a European Union. Look how hard it is for Great Britain to get out of it. And they can't figure any way to get out of that European Union. It's just the claws and the tentacles are already there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes back to, you remember in the Old Testament where Daniel prophesied that God's kingdom will not come on earth until certain things happen. One of them was one of the empires brought the rule of law. Well, once it brings the rule of law, it doesn't mean, the rule of law will always work. Just like the 5 documents that we've learned about in this history. Those in power make promises that they hardly ever keep. But it's up to us to hold them to keep our power from being abused. The problem is, the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. It's no different than in your church history. It didn't take long for the churches to stray from the pattern that the apostles established. But once they've strayed from the pattern, the response was not, oh, look, we were strayed from the pattern, so we're just stuck here. No. You had to have a mind to restore the true form of religion, the true pattern of Christianity. This is no different. We have the power, unless we refuse to use that power. They've given us a form of government where we can correct it without.
Or unless certain forces are successful in numbing us in ignorance, then we don't have anything to concern ourselves with other people.
That's true. That's the whole purpose of this class. Because we also suffer from ignorance of the Bible, which is how you get all the different colors of Christianity. It is no different. The same remedy for us teaching the world about Christ and teaching the correct pattern exists for us to be able to restore the form of government that we were given. But just like Patrick Henry said, we have a republic, but it's up to us to keep it. Thank you. pick up there next week.